Norway is relatively small in terms of population, with only about 5.2 million inhabitants. For comparison, this is fewer than the populations of many average capitals, and you'll, for example, find many more people living in London or Istanbul alone. Despite its modest population size, Norway spans an extensive area of approximately 385,000 square kilometers, making it roughly 245 times larger than London's geographical size. Similarly, Norway's geographic size is comparable to that of Japan, and both nations feature mountainous terrains. However, Japan has a population that is 22 times greater than Norway's within similar geographic conditions. This sparse distribution renders Norway one of the most sparsely populated and emptiest countries globally, ranking in spot 226 out of 249 countries and territories in the world, and exhibiting the lowest population density in mainland continental Europe. The northern part of Norway stretches beyond the Arctic Circle, characterized by a harsh, rugged, and cold environment with a thin topsoil layer above the bedrock and a brief growing season. These conditions historically were not conducive to supporting large populations, with only 2.2% of the land considered arable, comparable to the arable land percentage in Somalia, Jordan, and Andorra. Out of Norway's vast land area, only about 7,124 square kilometers are suitable for agriculture, an amount similar to that found in Eritrea, which is 3 times smaller in size, but has a roughly equivalent population of about 4 million. And is widely considered a failed state. Both countries have a similar proportion of usable agricultural land to support their populations. Moreover, in Norway, the small patches of arable land are dispersed throughout the south in narrow valleys between large mountains, complicating the development of large, integrated, and efficient farms. In contrast, the expansive arable lands in, for example, Denmark, allow for farm sizes that are more than 6 times larger than those in Norway, resulting in more integrated, efficient, and productive agricultural operations capable of feeding many more people. These geographical and agricultural limitations severely hinder Norway's farming capabilities, which has led to the country looking for other avenues of growth throughout its history. Throughout Norway's history, there has been a prevailing assumption that due to its limited agricultural potential, the country was destined to be poor, or at least that it remained economically backward until the discovery of oil in the late 1960s. As a Dane, I even bought into this story myself. However, the reality is quite different. Oil did not create wealth from scratch. It merely augmented the existing wealth of Norway. Contrary to common belief, Norway has been relatively affluent for much of its history, a fact that ironically relates to the very geographic challenges that complicate its agriculture. The rugged terrain that makes farming difficult also offers other advantages that have historically influenced the nation's fate beyond simple crop production. For instance, the ease of navigating around the country and conducting trade has been pivotal. Land travel across Norway has been notoriously difficult for millennia, with steep mountains and deep fjords making overland journeys near impossible before the advent of modern highways and tunnels. Yet what at first seems like a geographical curse has turned into a significant blessing. Norway's indented coastline, punctuated by numerous fjords, is recognized as one of the longest in Europe, over 6.5 times longer than that of the United Kingdom. In fact, it ranks as the second longest in the world, trailing only behind Canada, and Norway has the most amount of coast compared to its size out of all nations on Earth. This extensive coastline meant that as Norway evolved into a nation-state, its small population was naturally dispersed in small clusters throughout the mountainous terrain and along the fjords, somewhat similar to other mountainous societies like Afghanistan or Persia. However, unlike these inland regions, Norway's communities had immediate access to the global ocean, facilitated by fjords that cut deeply into the interior. This unique geography fostered a robust maritime culture from early on. The fjords not only enabled Norwegians to travel swiftly between settlements by sea, but also allowed traders to access the interior regions easily, reaching the vast forested areas that are among Norway's most significant natural resources. Thus, while Norway's geographic conditions presented challenges for agriculture, they simultaneously created a framework for thriving maritime and trade activities that have significantly contributed to its historical and ongoing wealth. While Norway has never boasted the largest forests in Europe, surpassed by Russia, Finland, Sweden, and even France. It dominated the European lumber industry for centuries up to the late 18th century. This dominance was largely due to the accessibility of its forested interiors via the fjords, which facilitated the transportation of timber to global markets. Lumber was harvested in the interior, then economically transported downstream to mills along the fjords. There, powered by river currents and waterfalls, sawmills processed the timber, which was then easily exported via the fjords. The advent of railroads in other European nations like Russia, Finland, and Sweden eventually eclipsed Norway's lumber industry by unlocking the potential of their more extensive forest. However, throughout the Age of Sail, Norway's geographical advantages established it as a lumber powerhouse. This industry significantly influenced the country's maritime culture, leading to the construction of a world-class merchant fleet. By the early 20th century, Norway had the fourth largest merchant marine fleet globally. The nature of Norway's geography, extensive coastlines connecting dispersed, low-density population centers, fostered not only a unique maritime culture, but also a cooperative spirit among communities. This cooperation was crucial in the shipbuilding industry, where entire towns would collaborate, sharing both the labor and the benefits. From lumberjacks to craftsmen, shares in ship ownership were distributed widely, leading to a decentralized wealth and ownership structure. This prevented the emergence of a powerful capitalist class, as seen in other European countries like France and Britain, where economic and political power were more centralized. Thus, Norway's social and economic fabric evolved distinctly, with widespread cooperation and shared enterprise at its core, shaping a society with broadly distributed wealth and a communal approach to economic activity. While Marx and Lenin talked about cooperatives, Norway actually developed this economic theory long before their more radical later renditions in the Soviet Union and China came to be. In order to spread the wealth and risk among the people in rural Norway, Norway's late 1800s and early 1900 period saw the economy thriving under cooperative fishing industries, cooperative lumber companies, and even cooperative banking unions owned by the people they served. The big difference was that this approach came from the people and was often not pushed on entire industries by the state. It was the bedrock of a country which, in all honesty, could not afford to have 20% of their population owning 80% of its wealth. Many of the cooperatives that were founded in the 1800s still live on today, like the Cooperative Forestry Company or the Norwegian Farmers Cooperative. Contrary to the perception of Norway as a poor country during the 19th century, it was actually prospering significantly relative to much of Europe. By the 1820s, Norway's GDP per capita was already surpassing that of all Eastern European countries. By the 1880s, it had exceeded most of Southern Europe, including Portugal, Spain, and Greece. By 1913, Norway's economic output per capita had surpassed Italy's, and by 1950, it had surpassed Germany and France. Put this into context, that is Norway being the seventh wealthiest country in Europe before the advent of Norwegian oil. A significant factor in Norway's rapid economic growth between 1900 and 1938 was the introduction of water turbines and hydroelectric dams, which dramatically enhanced its geographical potential. Norway's landscape, covered extensively by rivers that begin in the high mountains and cascade down to the coast, benefits from westerly winds that bring a lot of rain. The steep descents and waterfalls of these rivers create a vast amount of kinetic energy, ideal for generating electricity through turbines, with which Norway developed the prototype for artificial fertilizer. Beginning in 1905, Norway invited foreign companies with advanced technical skills to build modern hydroelectric dams, significantly expanding its hydroelectric capacity. Consequently, numerous hydroelectric power stations were constructed across the country. As of 2024, Norway hosts 84 large hydroelectric power stations with capacities greater than 10 megawatts and 838 smaller stations with capacities between 1 and 10 megawatts, alongside hundreds of even smaller stations. Combined, these facilities generate an impressive 95% of Norway's total electricity demand, positioning Norway as the seventh largest hydroelectric power producer globally, with a generation rate more than half that of the United States, but for only a fraction of the population. The early 20th century development of hydroelectric power in Norway catalyzed the country's first major economic boom, allowing it to rapidly industrialize and electrify. By 1920, Norway had the highest electricity consumption per capita in the world, with over 2/3 of its population having access to electricity, twice the rate of the United States at that time. This abundance of energy enabled the Norwegians to establish highly energy-intensive industries, notably leading to the specialization in refined aluminum production by the company Norsk Hydro, which is today one of the largest aluminum producers globally. Norsk Hydro sources most of its energy for aluminum production from Norway's hydropower and is 34% owned by the Norwegian state, making Norway the leading aluminum producer in Europe and the 8th largest globally, as well as the primary supplier to the European Union. The early 20th century influx of foreign investment into Norway's hydroelectric sector helped build its infrastructure, but also threatened national control over these vital resources. Despite its small, dispersed population and lack of substantial capital and technical expertise, Norway was cautious about the rapid nationalization of foreign investments, which could deter future foreign expertise and investment. To balance national control with the need for foreign investment and technical knowledge, Norway implemented strategic regulations for foreign investors. These stipulations mandated that hydroelectric power stations and mines constructed and financed by foreign entities would revert to the Norwegian government without compensation after 60 to 80 years of operation. This policy ensured that foreign investors could achieve returns on their investments while eventually transferring control of key resources back to Norway. This pragmatic long-term strategy has significantly influenced Norway's approach to its hydro and later oil and gas industries, ensuring that over 90% of the country's hydroelectric capacity remains publicly owned by the state today. Through these measures, Norway has successfully secured national control over its resources while fostering a favorable environment for continued foreign investment. My good Norwegian friend Magnus will discuss some of the current issues around national control today, later in the video, including how there's a growing concern about Norwegian politicians selling the power to an ever-hungry EU at the expense of high rises in electricity bills to Norwegians. By the late 1950s, Norway was already recognized as a wealthy, heavily industrialized democracy with low levels of corruption. However, at that time, there was widespread skepticism about the potential for finding oil or gas in the waters around Norway, particularly in the shallow areas of the European continental shelf under the North Sea. This skepticism was reflected in a 1958 report by the Geological Survey of Norway, which dismissed the possibility of discovering significant oil or gas resources on the Norwegian continental shelf, a statement that would soon prove to be one of the worst expert statements in economic history. In 1959, just a year after the report, a major natural gas discovery in the Groningen field in northern Netherlands dramatically shifted perspectives. This field turned out to be the 11th largest natural gas field ever discovered globally and the largest within Europe, catapulting the Netherlands into the role of a major gas-producing nation and establishing it as a cornerstone of the European gas market. This discovery reignited interest and speculation about the untapped potential beneath the North Sea, suggesting that similar discoveries could be waiting in areas yet to be explored. This renewed interest led to increased exploration activity, and in 1962, American oil giant Phillips was the first to apply for a license to explore for oil and gas in the Norwegian sector of the North Sea. At that time, the exact maritime boundaries of the North Sea were not yet legally defined among the neighboring countries. However, in 1965, in a bid to expedite exploration and drilling, the UK government agreed to divide the continental shelf based on the median line principle, a line equidistant between the UK and Norway's nearest points of land. This agreement facilitated the beginning of extensive exploration and drilling operations by various international entities eager to tap into the North Sea's hidden resources. Years after its initial agreement with the UK to define maritime boundaries based on the median line principle in 1965, Norway reaped enormous benefits from this somewhat hasty decision. The calculation considered the myriad of Norwegian islands just off the western coast, including the island of Utsira, situated 16 kilometers west of the mainland. This inclusion shifted the median line slightly westward, extending Norway's maritime boundary by several kilometers. This adjustment proved fortuitous when the massive Statfjord oil field was discovered in the 1970s along the median line. With only 15% of the field lying within the UK zone and the remaining 85% within Norwegian waters, Norway gained billions in additional oil revenue from this arrangement. Just to put this into perspective, Utsira Island has earned Norway a large part of the now estimated $159 billion worth of oil pumped up on the Norwegian side of Statfjord. Shortly after establishing the median line, Norway began issuing exploration licenses to experienced foreign companies, including Phillips, which struck oil in 1967 at the Balder field. Although initially deemed not economically viable, Balder would not begin production until the 1990s. The real boon came just before Christmas 1969, when Phillips announced the discovery of the Ekofisk field, one of the largest offshore oil fields ever found. Production at Ekofisk started in 1971, marking the beginning of a series of significant oil and gas discoveries on the Norwegian continental shelf, including fields like Statfjord, Oseberg, Gullfaks, and Troll. The latter became particularly famous in 1996, when Norway undertook the monumental task of moving the Troll A platform, the heaviest and tallest structure ever transported by humans across the surface of the Earth from the Norwegian mainland to the field. During this time, Norway smartly used what it had learned from its hydroelectric industry for its new oil and gas industries. Soon after they started producing oil, Norway set up a government-owned company called Statoil. This was similar to what they did in the hydroelectric industry, where they made rules for foreign oil and gas companies to make sure their investments matched what was best for Norway. An important rule was that Statoil would own more than 50% of any oil or gas operation, which encouraged foreign companies to invest, but also helped Statoil learn a lot by working together with these companies. As it turned out, the Norwegian continental shelf was rich in oil and gas reserves, positioning Norway as the holder of the largest oil reserves in Europe outside of Russia, and ranking it 20th worldwide, comparable to former OPEC countries like Angola and Ecuador. Norway's reserves are more than 3 times greater than those of the UK, the country that they share the longest sea border with. In terms of natural gas, Norway also boasts the largest reserves in Europe outside of Russia, ranking as number 21 globally, with volumes similar to those of Kuwait and Iran. Norway's strategic location near the European Union's market perfectly positions it as a primary supplier, especially since the EU has limited domestic oil and gas resources beyond the reserves in the UK and Groningen gas field in the Netherlands. Historically, the EU has relied heavily on imports for its energy needs from Russia, but that all changed with the war in Ukraine. Oil, being liquid, poses fewer logistical challenges as it can be transported globally in barrels or containers via sea. This flexibility allows the EU to import oil from distant producers, like those in the Americas or Nigeria, without significant difficulty. However, the situation with natural gas is quite different. As a gas, it occupies a large volume, making it economically impractical to transport via containers. Before the advent of liquefied natural gas technology, the natural gas market was inherently regional due to these logistical challenges. This led to the construction of extensive pipeline networks within Europe to transport gas from nearby sources, including the Netherlands, Algeria, the Soviet and later Russian Siberian fields, and of course Norway. Throughout the 20th and early 21st centuries, these pipelines primarily sourced gas from Norway, Russia, and Algeria, making the EU heavily reliant on imports from these key neighboring regions for its natural gas supply. By 2021, Norway had established a network of 11 undersea gas pipelines, connecting its gas reserves directly to European markets. By 2010, Norwegian gas production had surpassed oil production for the first time, driven by increasing demand from the EU and the UK. Around 2012, Norway became the second largest natural gas exporter to the EU, trailing only behind Russia. By 2021, the year before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia provided about 40% of the EU's total gas imports, while Norway contributed around 25%. In terms of oil, Russia supplied 25% of the EU's imports, compared to Norway's substantial 99.4%. By this time, Norway was making billions of dollars each year from oil and gas, turning it into a kind of petrostate similar to Russia. In 2021, oil and gas made up about 21% of Norway's total economy and 51% of its exports. However, unlike other petrostates that often face corruption and strong controlling governments because they depend so much on oil and gas, Norway was different. This difference is partly because there's no clear definition of a petrostate. Usually, these are countries that rely so heavily on oil and gas money that their economies would fail without it. Norway stands out because of how it runs its government, distributes wealth, and manages its economy, which keeps it from falling into the same traps as other countries rich in natural resources. Globally, 25 countries from regions such as South America, Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and Asia are typically recognized as pure petrostates. According to the Economist Democracy Index, almost all these countries are categorized as either authoritarian or hybrid regimes, with the exceptions of Indonesia and Norway. However, Norway differentiates itself even from Indonesia by being ranked as one of the most democratic, free, and egalitarian societies on Earth by the same index. The reason Norway has not succumbed to the authoritarian tendencies often associated with immense oil and gas riches lies in its unique combination of geography, historical policies, and a long-standing culture of communal resource ownership. From the early days of oil discovery, Norway was already a prosperous, industrialized democracy with decentralized wealth and power, principles deeply embedded in its societal fabric dating back to its lumber and hydroelectric industries. This foundational democratic ethos and structured approach to resource management have shielded Norway from the pitfalls that typically befall other resource-rich nations, setting a stark contrast to the typical governance issues seen in many other oil-rich states. So how rich is Norway really? I did a video on the Oil Fund a few months back that puts this into perspective, but here are some highlights. In Norway's sovereign wealth fund, also known as the Oil Fund, Norway has saved an immense $1.6 trillion. That is more than half of Russia's total yearly output before expenses. The yearly passive growth of this fund alone is more than Norway's yearly state budget. If Norway were to sell all its shares and property tied up in the fund, each citizen would have $1 million. And in total, the fund owns about 1.5% of all shares in the world, including a fair amount of stocks in Tesla, Apple, Walmart, and Visa. But let's not paint a too rosy picture. To talk a bit about the challenges Norway is currently facing, I've brought in my good Norwegian friend Magnus, who will share a bit on how Norway is starting to struggle in certain areas.
Thanks, Max. Well, where do I start? Let me first be abundantly clear that Norway is doing better than most states in the world, but that doesn't mean that we don't have our own share of problems. First of all, the new breed of Norwegian politicians seem a far cry away from the politicians of old who made Norway keep the oil as a national asset. An example of this is how, against popular opinion, consecutive right and left aligned governments have essentially wrecked much of Norway's power market. We've been sold this idea that electricity won't be more expensive if we let Germany and the UK plug into our hydropower with massive cables. But the reality is that prices are extremely expensive compared to what they used to be before the cables were built, and the politicians seem unwilling to address this issue. Norway has extremely cold winters, and we're very dependent on power for our heating. Secondly, a lot of politicians, ranging from the previous Prime Minister to several other ministers, have recently been caught in big scandals surrounding insider trading, cheating on their taxes, or claiming benefits from the states which they aren't supposed to have. All in all, it seems that the good times are creating a breed of career politician who doesn't really have any real life experience or responsibility to their oath of office. It is something that Norway's people needs to address in the upcoming elections.
Thanks, Magnus. As always, we hope you enjoyed this video on how Norway became one of the richest nations on Earth while still keeping its focus on democracy and rights in focus.